pay for. I know we're on one ourselves in Sikkim365.com, but I work there, so I get that. And that's a great premium section, but it's the only one I pay for. It's not much. Theathletic.com is incredible. Ari Wasserman joins us now on Sikkim 365 Radio. Ari, your thoughts about today, thank you for your time. The NCAA, what they released, took forever, and in the end, did they get it right with Baylor?
Yeah, I'm not necessarily sure exactly what, the expectation was or what people were, hoping to get out of this. I know that Art Briles had some comments about it, and it's probably just right around what I would expect. It's a very obviously a tough situation, a sad one, and it's really kind of hard to, kind of break down in a 3 or 4 minute period. But it really is, something that has left a mark on this game and has left a mark on Briles and everybody that was involved in it.
Ari, I know that people, wanted something. They wanted the NCAA to do something because then maybe it has implications for how you handle things in the future. But maybe is this kind of the NCAA, right before the governance structure, kind of saying like, look, there's nothing we can do now, and this is why we need new governance so that maybe there's something we can do about these things in the future.
Yeah, the toughest thing about some of this stuff is that, like, I don't know if I'm alone in this, but I don't necessarily care what the NCAA has to say when we're talking about things that transcend football and the rules within it, And, it's about being a human being. It's about people being treated the right way. And, that to me is a whole other discussion that, I don't even think I'm qualified to discuss. I'm more concerned with, the expanded playoff and all those different things. And it's like when it comes to being a good human and when it comes to, what's right and wrong just in the grand scheme of things, I think that's a completely different realm. And, the NCAA serves its purpose, and some people will say they do a good job and some will do it bad. But, when it comes to things like this, it's like I don't really find myself too fascinated to think about what the NCAA will do because it's just bigger than football.
Well, let's speak of why I originally had you on. Obviously, the college football landscape changing with Texas and Oklahoma whenever that happens. There's always the talk about who else might do something. You're very closely tied in because of you covered the Big Ten for as long as you did. Do they just sit? They're making a lot of money. Do you feel like that they're just going to sit back and watch the next maybe move, or do you feel like that perhaps they're looking around themselves?
I think that everybody has to put themselves in a position where they aren't going to be blindsided by wholesale changes to the sport. There were a lot of people that were kind of blindsided by what happened with the Big 12. And usually when these types of things happen, especially ones as significant as, Oklahoma or Texas going to the SEC, which are two of the biggest brands in the sport, that's usually based on the history of the sport that we love, the first domino or something like that falls where there's a whole restructuration of the entire sport. So, trying to predict who will be the next to act or which conference is going to try to, expand or, I've even heard people think that it makes sense to retract a little bit so there's more revenue sharing amongst the teams that have the biggest brands in the conference. That's a really hard thing to do. But if I were a conference commissioner or an administrator at a college that was in a Power 5 conference, I would do everything within my power to make sure that I was having every discussion that I could with anybody who wanted to have a discussion. So when and if there is change, which is inevitable at this point, my program or my conference will be ready to keep up with the times because it's kind of a, eat or get eaten type of a situation and, kind of definitely a sensitive time in the sport if you're one of the teams that is left over in the Big 12 right now.
So what is the Big Ten's biggest concern? Would it be matching the SEC in terms of league size or worrying about some sort of super league forming where the majority of the teams in the Big Ten would get left out and they just take, 3 or 4 off the top?
Well, the good news for the Big Ten is that their major brand for the one that would be one of the first picks in the Super League draft has been steadfast in its support of the Big Ten and Ohio State. This is all driven by money, and the Big Ten is, or was at least, the most lucrative conference in the country. So, I don't know what the biggest scare would be. Obviously, the horror story would be something happening where Ohio State was no longer affiliated with it. But as things stand right now, that doesn't seem to be the case. I guess expanding makes a lot of sense if you want to add more premier brands. But here's the problem with that. It's like, who is left? If you're the Big Ten, who do you go after? Do you go after USC? Do you go after, who do you go after? And if you're in that situation, then it's just kind of impossible to do. So you're prudent and you keep up and keep track, but you're not necessarily in a position to be aggressive right now because there's no one really out there.
Ari, what are your thoughts on scheduling alliances? We've heard that thrown around as well. If this doesn't see in the next phase, actual consolidation or teams jumping from one place, there is a possibility. We heard about the Pac-12 talking with the Big Ten. We know the Pac-12's talk with the Big 12 or the 8 remaining. What are your thoughts on maybe conferences with these scheduling alliances being more of a common thing?
I think that the entire reason for the sport shifting and conferences expanding is for what? It's television rights. And the best thing about that is that fans get better games, hopefully, or at least that's what's supposed to be, expected. And there's two ways of looking at expansion, really. There's the financial implications of the institutions that are involved in the expansion, which I don't think fans really care that much about because they're more interested in games. And then there's the other side of it. Are there going to be more games to watch and more entertaining football? So if you're in a situation where you're losing big brands like the Big 12, I think it makes a ton of sense. You put yourself in a position where you can have more televised games against better opponents that get more viewership and then make more money. And that's the name of the game right now. So I'm all for it. I think anything that leads to more entertainment for the fans who support the sport is a good thing. And getting bogged down by the minutia of how much more money Texas or Oklahoma is going to make I don't think that interesting to the people who've watched the games.
Ari, if you look at the Big Ten, do they regret anybody that's a part of that conference?
I think you can make a joke about Rutgers and Maryland, but at the time, the expansion was about captivating television markets and expanding homes that have access to the Big Ten. And despite the fact that Rutgers and Maryland haven't been that competitive on the football field for the most part, the Big Ten has done a lot of good things in terms of how to make money. And Jim Delaney, the former conference commissioner, was a genius. So I don't know right now if there's any regret. I think that you could make a case that there are certain teams in the Big Ten that aren't, doing their share to make as much money as they make. The Purdue's of the world, the Illinois. But I think what you're going to find with these conferences is, as they expand or as the Super League happens or anything that goes on in the sport, there are going to be a lot of programs that are in the right place at the right time and continue to be a part of major money-generating conferences because they joined them at a good time, which is good leadership for them. So, at this point, I guess there is a discussion of, should the Big Ten retract, maybe kick out a few of the bottom dwellers that, aren't necessarily drawing eyeballs, but then you run into a problem of game inventory and how much a package could be sold to a television network. So it's a really complex situation. And obviously, no conference would sit there and say, hey, we love every single person equally or every single program equally. But whenever you go down this road, there are so many factors and implications that have to happen as a result of that in order to get it 100% right. So it'll be very fascinating to see how they proceed moving forward.
Ari, what are your thoughts on just the remaining 8 and the position they're in now? I mean, obviously that was a shockwave from Texas and Oklahoma. Everybody's got to trust each other and say that they're trusting each other, but yet I think everybody knows there's always the chance that somebody's also, taking other phone calls. They have to do what's in their best interest. But what do you just make of the current 8, their outlook moving forward or lack thereof?
Yeah, I guess the idea is in a perfect world, you have some pretty important brands there, and those brands, even though they're not Texas and Oklahoma, if they stick together, are a valuable asset to somebody. And the other thing to take into account, too, is when and if this playoff expands to 12 teams, the idea of Power 5 and Group of 5 is going to be extinct. So, there is actually a scenario where if they, add some teams or combine with a Pac-12, group or the AAC or whatever other rumors that we've heard, you put yourself in a position to be a pretty entertaining conference and a conference where if you win it, you make the playoffs. 12 is a pretty big number if it comes to that. And, I think the number one thing, obviously, when it comes to the administrators of these schools is how much money are they going to generate, and are they in a position where they can invest into their football programs and create the best possible program they can based on that television revenue. But as it comes to what the fans should think, it's maybe Baylor will be in a position to win a Big 12 championship again, or TCU, or Texas Tech. I mean, some of these teams that were kind of roadblocked by Texas and Oklahoma now can rule a new conference and make the playoffs. So, I think there's a chance if things go well for there to be certain leagues that might not be as competitive on the field as the SEC, but also in the spirit of the sport of trying to be more inclusive and, have some new faces and names in the playoff or in the playoff discussion, it actually could work out well. So, it's super complex, and I know that it's just not going to always be so clean where everybody stays together and you're in it for your brother and all that stuff. I think money talks in these situations, but I don't know if I would think it's a doomsday scenario as long as these programs and teams have fan interest willing to support those teams.
Yeah, that roadblock is definitely in Norman, Oklahoma, most of the time with what they've done with the Big 12. I saw your article about the coaches poll that came out, overrated, underrated. And I mentioned yesterday, or whenever that poll came out, I guess it's a day or two ago, that I was surprised that Alabama, not that they were one, but they got 63 of 65 first-place votes. I understand, okay, who else? But I guess you, in a way, I don't know if you looked at it that way. That's how I looked at it, Ari, that they got 63 of 65 first-place votes, and yet they have this turnover, and yes, they always seem to handle it. Your thoughts about Alabama?
Yeah, listen, it's a coaches poll. Most coaches don't even vote. Some ops guy does it. And it's just a super easy thing to pick Alabama to be number one. And I wrote in the column that I did that they were overrated because when you think about how much they lost off of a super team, maybe the best team in college football history, when you think about the talent that was on that roster, there's a lot gone. And I know that Nick Saban alone and his reputation and what he's done at Alabama probably is warranting of a number one, pole position because of just the respect on his name. But there are other teams in the league that they play in and other teams in college football that are probably more equipped from a standpoint of talent and returning experience to earn that number one spot. So when I look at the poll, I don't look at it as a way of saying, well, who's usually good? Or who's going to be good because they've been good in the past. It's like, of course, Ohio State and Alabama are going to be good, and they're probably going to be in the discussion for the national championship in November. But as things stand right now, I would have put Georgia number one, based on having a returning quarterback with experience who was a five-star prospect, addressing some needs in their secondary, and having a ton of returning talent. And, it's just there's multiple ways to look at it. And when we get the context of more games and more results, you get put in a position where you have more information to make these rankings. But as we sit here in mid-August waiting for the games to start, the best that we can do is use what's actually on these rosters to try to figure out, hey, who should be number one? And Alabama is certainly the number one program in college football, but I'm not necessarily sure they've earned the right just because they're Alabama to be number one in the coaches poll. The good news is it doesn't mean anything. It has no bearing whatsoever on what happens on the field, and it's more off-season fodder. But that's what we're talking about here, and that's what's fun about this job.
Ari, obviously there's been a lot going on just in changes in college football. The Quinn Ewers decision a few days ago was obviously a very interesting one. We've seen name, image, and likeness start to weave its way into the fabric of college football. What have been your thoughts on just this new era of sorts, and what have been maybe a couple of things that have stood out to you from it?
Just that some rules are stupid, like high school football players in Texas not being able to benefit off their name, image, and likeness. And I promise you, it might not be this year. It might not even be next year, but eventually that rule is going to go away because it doesn't make any sense. If a person has the ability to earn money from anybody doing anything within the realm of the law, I think it's very un-American to pretend like they shouldn't be able to make it based on rules of athletics that don't really make any sense. And as players now in the new world of NIL have an opportunity to go make money legally through the NCAA rules at the college level, and they have a chance to do that, then they're going to do that. And the Texas Rules Association is going to have to pick what they want. Do they want to change that stupid rule, or do they want their players to continually leave? And that's what it's going to come to. So there's 5-year-olds on YouTube reviewing toys and making over $1 million a year. A high school football player who is as marketable as Quinn Ewers certainly deserves any check that he can get, and I don't blame him for doing what he did, even if it was only part of the reason he went to Ohio State early.
Ari, thank you. Appreciate your time. Have a great week.
Yeah, anytime, guys. Thank you.
Ari Wasserman, the Athletic College Football, at Ari Wasserman on Twitter, national college writer, covered the Big Ten, Ohio State for a long, long time. On the part about